Think of your favorite game. Maybe it's The Last of Us, Red Dead Redemption 2, or Batman Arkham City. There's probably a part in that game that you dread replaying. A section that feels way worse than the rest of the experience for no reason at all. Where spacing, mechanics, atmosphere, and somehow the developers still decided to put it in the game. Marvel Spider-Man has the MJ missions, Resident Evil 2 has the sewers, Uncharted Drake's Fortune has the jet ski chapter. But why does this happen? Why do great games have sections that feel completely out of place? What I think is a bad part in a game can be completely different than what you think is bad. Maybe you loved the MJ missions, or thought that the sewers were the best part of Resident Evil 2. Not every annoying segment can automatically be classified as a bad segment, and it's almost impossible to come up with a fully objective answer since enjoyment in games is so subjective. But after replaying a lot of great games, I have noticed a few patterns in bad sections. As you play through a game, you start building an idea of what the game is supposed to play and feel like. In Spider-Man, you have a lot of movement, speed, and the freedom to decide how you tackle every enemy encounter. You can be stealthy, rely on your spider sense, spam gadgets, but when you play through the MJ sections, all of that changes. You move super slow, you are forced to use stealth, and getting spotted instantly fails the mission. The stealth mechanic is not the issue. The issue is that Spider-Man already has a stealth mechanic, and it is a lot more fun. You can crawl across ceilings, web enemies to walls, and improvise during encounters instead of following a specific path. That is why these sections feel so disconnected from the rest of the game. It stops feeling like you're playing Spider-Man and starts feeling like you're playing this other random game. Some bad segments exist because developers suddenly introduced entirely new mechanics that the game was never designed around, like the jet ski chapter in Uncharted Drake's Fortune. For most of the game, Uncharted focuses on climbing and shooting. Then, out of nowhere, the game turns into a vehicle combat section where you have to steer this jet ski while shooting enemies at the same time. The controls are extremely clunky and the mechanic feels underdeveloped compared to everything else in the game. Now, this game came out a long time ago, so it is obviously going to have a few performance issues here and there. However, the shooting mechanics are polished because the entire game is built around them. The jet ski mechanics are not, because they only exist for one small section of the game. A lot of bad segments come from developers trying to add variety instead of expanding the mechanics players already enjoy. But adding something different does not automatically make the game more fun, since it often leads to sections like this one if done incorrectly. Variety is not always a bad thing. Some games introduce completely different mechanics and still make them feel polished and fun. Even vehicle combat sections can work when they are given enough depth and attention. The problem is when these mechanics feel rushed or underdeveloped compared to the rest of the game. You can immediately tell when a section exists just to mix things up or add new things, instead of actually trying to improve the experience. Tone shifts are also not always a bad thing. Some games use them extremely well to keep the experience fresh. For example, Resident Evil Requiem constantly switches between darker, horror-focused sections and more action-heavy moments, but both styles still feel connected to the overall identity of the game. The problem is when a tone shift feels disconnected from everything that came before it, which happens in the island section of Resident Evil 4. The game starts incredibly strong with the village and castle areas. Everything feels mysterious and atmospheric. There's cults, abandoned places, and the medieval architecture all add to the mood of the game. Then the island completely changes that mood. Instead of a horror environment, you suddenly fight through military bases filled with turrets, machine guns, and enemies carrying assault rifles. The atmosphere becomes far more action-focused, and a lot of the creepy, medieval identity that made the earlier sections memorable starts to disappear. And the island is not necessarily terrible on its own. After all, Resident Evil 4, even through the village sections, was a bit action-focused, so that is not the problem. The problem is that compared to the rest of the game, it feels like it belongs to a different experience entirely and kind of removes the immersion of Resident Evil 4. All of these segments would be fine if they were shorter. However, when you have to deal with these for a long time, it starts feeling like a chore. The island segment in RE4 would have been fine if it was a lot shorter, or if we only played as MJ once in Spider-Man. It would still have sucked, but it would have been more manageable. These are some of the aspects that make up those bad segments in great games. But why do they happen? Notice how every game I have mentioned so far has been a AAA game. In reality, this issue occurs mostly for games with big budgets and hundreds of developers. Players want longer campaigns, bigger worlds, more mechanics, more side content, and more variety. Because of this, modern AAA games often try to be many different things at once and wear many different hats, which leads to a bad segment here and there. Every new mechanic requires development time, testing, and refinement, and there is not enough time to do all of that for every mechanic and for every single area of the game. Some of them will get more attention than others. When a game is built around a core set of systems, those systems become more polished through hundreds and hundreds of hours of iteration. The extra mechanics that don't get a lot of time often do not get the same level of refinement, which is why they can feel weaker than the rest of the game. The larger and more ambitious a game becomes, the harder it is to ensure that every single section reaches the same level of quality. These games are great for a reason, and that's why these segments stand out so much. Nobody remembers the worst part of a mediocre game. We remember the worst part of great games because the rest of the experience sets such a high standard. If the Resident Evil 4 Island section was its own game, it would just be a mediocre game. However, since it is a part of such a great game, it is just a bad section. Bad sections do not ruin great games. In a strange way, they remind us just how good the rest of the game really is.